Hello. Okay. Okay. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Now, my name is Jenny Smithers and I'm the co-convener of Lighter Footprints. And Sarah Hegarty, where are you, Sarah? There she is. She's our other co-convener. So, and she'll be talking to you at the end of the evening, so stay awake. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. It really is. We appreciate your support. So tonight we are meeting here on Wurundjeri country, and we pay our respects to the Wurundjeri leaders, past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people here in the room. As COP30 gets underway at Berlin in the Amazon forest, we maybe are a little more mindful of the stewardship that First Nations people have done of our ecosystems and continue to do over the eons. We could learn a lot from them. So Lighter Footprints is really pleased that Dr Monique Ryan, the federal member for Kooyong, accepted our invitation to speak to us tonight about the challenges and opportunities to achieve climate action. Dr Monique Ryan will speak initially, then she will be joined by Tristan Edis for a conversation about climate and energy policy. It can be done, you might be surprised, but it can be done. So, and then for the final section, we will take questions from you, and we're using Slido, so have a look on your agenda. You'll see the bit for the Slido, and it's the QR code at the bottom that will take you to the link. And you can start popping your questions in now. And we're going to have Julia Curato and David Strang from the committee will be reading your questions and giving them to the panel. And so start popping them in now. I am guessing that most of you know that prior to entering politics, Dr Monique Ryan was a paediatric neurologist at the Royal Children's Hospital, where she was a clinician and a researcher. Perhaps many of you will be familiar with Tristan Edis' name. Tristan Edis has been an energy and carbon markets economist for over 20 years. You may have seen articles by Tristan in the Renew Economy or the AFR or the Australian perhaps, or elsewhere. I reckon that all of our politicians need Tristan Edis on their staff, certainly one section. Anyway, now just a reminder that at Lighter Footprints we are a polite mob. We will not tolerate comments or heckling from the audience. So once again, thank you for joining us, and let's welcome Dr Monique Ryan.
They're really, really cute stairs. They're incredibly thin. When the day comes that I can't get up them, I'll take that as a message. Thank you all for the opportunity to be with you this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, but I'd also really like to thank Lighter Footprints for their long history of sustained advocacy on climate and environmental matters. When I first came to be the candidate for the seat of Kooyong in 2021, having not been engaged in that space, in this space really in the past, having had an amateur's interest in climate and environment and understanding the importance of the need for action on these matters, but not being particularly engaged in the space. I'm sure many people from Lighter Footprints thought, who the hell is she and where does she come from and is she for real? But what I have experienced, and we can talk about this, I can talk about this with Tristan perhaps a little bit later, in the last 3.5 years, is the incredible generosity of so many people in the space to talk to people like me who care and are interested and want to understand the evidence and look at it in a balanced, hopefully rational and analytic fashion, but who aren't necessarily experts in energy markets or in the rollout of renewables or in oil and gas and the extraction and sales. The reality is that when you go to federal parliament, most people know very little about those things, but most people don't actually care that much about most of those things. And I think that having gone to Parliament as someone who did care about them and wanted to learn about them, I have benefited very much from the expertise and knowledge and deep experience of members of Lighter Footprints, the Beyond Gas Network, ACF, and all the very many other expert groups who've been incredibly generous with their advice in the last few years. So my brief this evening is to talk to you about where we are right now from a climate and an environment point of view, and talk to you about where we're going to go to from here, because to be honest, it is in some ways a slightly bleak time for those of us who care about climate action and who care about biodiversity and conservation and the environment. So when I was first elected to Parliament in the middle of 2022, we had an experience as a nation where our government changed from a group of climate denialists to a group of climate minimalists. And I think maybe, I'm not sure how the rest of you feel, but I sort of thought when I was elected, oh goodness, we've got this Albanese government and they're looking great and they're saying all the right things. Maybe I don't need to be there. You know, maybe the climate-focused independents who were elected in 2022 as a bit of a group weren't going to be really strictly necessary, particularly since there were three new Greens in the House at that point as well. And the Albanese government was saying all of the right things. Then we had a situation where the first piece of legislation that we passed was the Climate Change Act, and the government looked to be listening and to be consultative. Those of us who were new weren't used to reading legislation or understanding how we should be amending it or working on it, but they were happy to talk to us about it. And when we went to the government with suggestions from the climate groups that we had consulted with, they were open to looking at them and to taking them on. And so it seemed like an exciting time. We then had a situation where the government was clearly willing to fund the transition to renewables. It was happy to roll out tranches of subsidies and investment incentives. Wasn't interested in going to a carbon price, but that seemed reasonable given the politics and the history in the area. And it seemed to be sending out the right signals in general. But I think it's probably fair to say that since that time, many of us have been very disappointed by the Albanese government. For me, that disappointment has been particularly profound since the most recent election, where the government isn't sitting on a 1 or 2 seat majority. It's got a massive majority. It has 94 seats in the parliament, a super majority in fact, and a coalition which is in utter disarray. And it's still not acting on the things that we feel to be important. And the two things which have made that really apparent in the last month or two have been the climate targets that it's set in the face of evidence from the Climate Council as to the Climate Change Authority as to what they should look like. It set climate targets which were disappointingly modest, as you know, 62 to 70% by 2035. And then in the last 2 weeks in Parliament, we've seen the government push through the EPPC Act in a way that was extremely disappointing. So in the 47th Parliament, we had many, many phases of consultation. We spoke with Tanya Plibersek on innumerable occasions about what the EPPC Act reforms were going to look like. We were told it was going to be split into 3, and that would give us time to consider each part of those 3 sections at length and, you know, with due diligence, and to consult with the expert groups and to understand the potential implications of all of the parts of this enormous piece of legislation. But then that didn't happen. And in fact, before the end of the 47th Parliament, the Prime Minister overrode an agreement between Tanya Plibersek as the Environment Minister and the Greens because, you know, we all believe because of his concern around the domestic fortunes of the WA state government. So that was incredibly disappointing. And then what's happened most recently is that Murray Watt has given us a piece of legislation, 1,500 pages long, 2 Thursdays ago. and passed that legislation in the House last Thursday. And it wasn't a 1,500-page piece of legislation in terms of this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. It was 1,500 pages of, you look at this section in the original EPPC Act from 1999 and we're going to change this, do this, do this, do this. So you're sitting there trying to read it and you're having to go back to the original Act, and it was an incredibly complicated and confusing, complex piece of legislation. When we first looked at it, when we first had a chance to look at it, we did not get briefed on it in advance. When we first got a chance to look at it, we sort of thought, oh, it seems okay. And we spoke to a few people and they said, well, it seems okay. And then someone said, what's this thing about ministerial discretion? And it turned out that we had this incredibly complex piece of legislation, much of which was still going to be left to delegated regulations. So we didn't have all that, they said, we're going to set up these environmental impact standards, it's going to be great, we're going to have rules around what's going to be acceptable in every sector, and it'll be very clear what the goes are and what the no-goes are, and it's going to facilitate approvals, but also facilitate fast no's to some projects, and we're going to have all that, and we're going to have that. But then you realise that at the side is this situation where all of that can be overrode and pushed aside by ministerial discretion. So to me it was essentially negated, because the reality is that the government could decide to drill for oil and gas in my back garden tomorrow if it decides that that's in the national interest, or if it wants to mine critical minerals for Donald Trump because he's putting the hard word on us as a nation, regardless of the environmental impact of that or where that was needing to happen. It could happen if it was deemed by the minister to be in the national interest. So that was kind of frustrating. And the thing that added insult to injury for me was that in the same week, the other major piece of legislation that we were debating, which the government also rammed through last week, was the freedom of information legislation, which meant now that if anything is labelled, if you just stamp on it, cabinet document, it doesn't have to be released under freedom of information laws. I think you could just carry it through the cabinet room and you'd probably get away with that sort of determination, which means that any ministerial determination that might be made in the future can be subject to cabinet and confidence rules, and we won't understand. The minister won't have to explain to the Australian people the basis of that decision. It felt a bit egregious that we debated those two pieces of legislation in the same week. And it culminated last Thursday in a day where there were more amendments to a legislation, more votes in the House than any other days. It was the most votes in the House since 1935, because the crossbench put up 80 amendments to the EPPC Act, and the government accepted one. Kate Chaney was patting herself on the back and was saying, she was showing off. The rest of us didn't. None of us, the rest of us got ours up. So it's been a really frustrating time. And I guess it brings into sharp focus the need for effective opposition, effectively. And so, and we're not going to get that from the Liberals or the Nationals, regardless of what happens with Susan Lee in the next few weeks, regardless of where they land on net zero, where the Liberals land on net zero. We're not going to get effective opposition on climate or environment from the Liberals in this term of Parliament. It's just not going to happen. That's if the Liberals continue to exist as an entity. So it's up to the crossbench and it's up to the Greens. In the House, it's up to the Green. There's only one left, and she's hobbled. There's not very much that she can do as a single individual in a party that's been eviscerated at the House level. So it's very much up to the crossbench actually to keep the government to account in this term of government, and to work out how we're going to get some wins on the things that we really care about and that matter to us. It's still going to be possible, but it's not going to be through votes in the House of Reps. And I guess they're the things that I thought we could probably discuss tonight. How do we address these issues and keep pressure on a government that has a supermajority, which is a mile wide but an inch thick, many of those seats that the Albanese government won in 2025 will be very susceptible in 2028. And so that's something we need to keep in mind and plan for. But also, how do we, in the meantime, keep on the agenda the things that matter to us and where we can potentially have an effect? And basically, I think that they are smaller pieces of. Well, there's two bits to that. The first is looking at every piece of legislation that comes to the House or comes to the Senate through the lens of climate and environment. And the second is looking for smaller areas, discrete things where we can have an impact on policy settings that will be of significance. And that's where the crossbench will need to be effective. We'll have to work pretty hard, have to be agile and see opportunities and basically seize them in the moment. And I think we have done that in the last 3.5 years, and we've demonstrated a capacity to do that. And those of us who've been there for one or more terms now have learnt how to have an impact. While we were moving the 80 amendments last Thursday, the opposition was coming up with 50 questions about the EPPC Act. And at the end of the debate on the amendments in the consideration in detail phase, which is the sort of the last phase of the legislation passing, they weren't in the House. So, because they just weren't. The crossbench with them, we were all jumping up and down and on the spot, but also in our seats to speak. And but they weren't there. And then they appeared at the end and said, right, we're going to do our stuff now. And everyone said, actually, no, you missed it. And Angie Bell, who was the shadow minister, was saying, what? And we said, you missed it. You needed to be here 15 minutes ago. You can't answer those questions now. The day before, I was in the Federation Chamber speaking about the Freedom of Information legislation, and Andrew Wallace, who's the Shadow Attorney General, wanted to move some questions, but he missed his opportunity. Didn't seem entirely familiar with procedure in the chamber. And to me, that spoke to the fact that the crossbenchers are used to having to get around things and be agile and clever and quick and plan and seize our moment and use it as best we can. And we have the agility of being new to the thing, but also much more familiar with the process, I think, than many of the members of the major parties who don't necessarily always need to know parliamentary procedure. But if you don't, you can get caught out. David Pocock has used parliamentary procedure against the government twice this week in the Senate to great effect, and causing them much upset because he was clever and he knew procedure well. And there are times where you can turn the tables on people if you do that. So that's one thing we can do. We can use procedure and we can use the parliament. But I think in the last 3.5 years we have shown effect. The very first piece of legislation, as I said, was the Climate Change Act and in 2022, and it did get amended quite significantly by the crossbench. Then we had the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and we've been pushing the government on a whole raft of integrity measures for the last 3 years, and we'll continue to do that. In the last month or two alone, I've reintroduced my private member's bill on lobbying and on opening ministerial diaries, tightening enforcement of the lobbyist register, and closing the revolving door between senior public service and government ministerial jobs and the industries that they subserve, so that people like Christopher Pyne can't leave government and then take up a job as a defence lobbyist 9 days later, armed with the knowledge and the insider relationships that he had as defence minister. That's not right. It's corrosive of trust. It also throws into some question decisions he might have made in the months prior to leaving government. Zali has reintroduced her truth in political advertising legislation. Helen has reintroduced her whistleblower protections legislation. Sophie has reintroduced her private member's bill about jobs for mates. Kate reintroduced this week a bill around postal voting and has also reintroduced a bill around gambling reforms. The crossbench is united in wanting to work on integrity measures, but we've made space for each other in the last 3 years to have our own pieces and our own areas of expertise and interest, and we've learned how to work together on those sorts of things in the last 3 years, and we'll continue to do that. The other thing that we've done, though, in the climate space is we've mapped out our areas of interest, and so I have said in this term, mine is climate and health. And so the amendments that I moved last week to the EPPC bill included an amendment that just said, doesn't seem that unreasonable, that the government has to take into account the impact on any new fossil fuel or other development under the EPPC Act on air and water quality. The government didn't accept it. Didn't seem unreasonable to me. It's effectively an air and water trigger. There is a water trigger in the EPPC Act that was put in by Tanya Plibersek last year at Sophie Scomps's instigation, but it's not going to be effective as it's now written under the EPPC Act in its current form since last Thursday. But I'm going to continue to push for clean air regulation. And it's important. It's important not just in the environment and in terms of fossil fuel developments and mining developments. It's actually important if you live anywhere near the North East Link, because air quality over in that part of the world right now is not perfect. It's really affected by the developments and the infrastructure that have been putting in there. And many people care very much about air quality in built structures, particularly since COVID, knowing that we struggled very much with that during the COVID times. And when the next pandemic comes along, as it will, air quality is going to be front of mind again as well. So I'll be pushing on climate and the health impacts of climate change. And for me, that's a position of comfort and something that I feel I can speak to pretty effectively. Last week, when we passed legislation for the new Centre for Disease Control, I tried to improve the legislation by some amendments around monitoring and reporting the health impacts of climate change, also around gambling and the health impacts of that, also around pandemic preparedness, also around chronic disease management and monitoring, which the government didn't accept, but I'll continue to work on that. And other crossbenchers have got their own areas that they're pushing the government on, and we will get some wins over time. We will need to continue to work on the energy transition and to push the government on that, and we'll do that both at sort of the small-scale domestic level, but also large-scale in terms of the poles and wires and the large-scale energy transition. There's lots of things to do in that space. Another thing that I care about deeply, and I'm pushing the government on, is decarbonisation of transport. So the transport sector is the area of our economy where emissions are increasing most quickly at this point in time, and there's a lot that we can do about that. And again, it's relatively small pieces but discrete pieces. So we have the new vehicle efficiency standards. That's something that all of the crossbenchers, myself included, pushed for very hard in the last term of government, and that was a big win. But we still need, it's a bit of an ongoing fight, because we still need the government to push people to transition away from internal combustion engine cars. And there's various challenges there. Introduction of a road user charge would not help. A road user charge for people who drive EVs would not help. Doesn't really make sense. But we also need the government to remove things like the luxury car tax discount for people who are buying mega utes, which are actually making it cheaper to buy a mega ute than an efficient luxury car. That was something I tried to raise in the last parliament and ended up being screamed at by a number of nationals, because I was trying to, take away everyone's weekends, which was an interesting experience, and the particular national involved sadly lost his seat in May. I was devastated. There's lots of other things to do there as well, though. Decarbonisation of heavy transport. We have to get rid of things like the fuel tax credit system has to be modified significantly, because what we're basically giving the mining and heavy industries massive, $10 billion in fossil fuel subsidies a year to not decarbonise, which makes no sense at all. And there's lots of people with good ideas about how we can do that. They're all the pieces that individuals in the crossbench are going to pick up. At the same time that we're going to pick up things like the economic impact of the changes that we're seeing and how we can try and mitigate and limit them as best we can. And at the same time that we're trying to get the government to take responsibility for things like our Scope 3 emissions and the impact of them globally, rather than concentrating just on carbon reporting and measurement of emissions domestically. So there's lots to do. But I think it falls on the crossbench to do it. And I think it falls on us to hold the government to account as best we can, as effectively as we can for this term of government, but also to start planning for the next. And to start planning for a time where we may be the only effective, well, as we are now, the only effective opposition in federal parliament. I said recently on the ABC, I don't think it was well received, democracies don't do well when you don't have an effective opposition, and we've seen that in Victoria for some years. I didn't endear myself to the various people in the state parliament when I said that, but I think it's true. The Liberals haven't been an effective opposition at the state level for years, and we're paying the price as a state for that. People need to be held to account when they're in government, and at this point the coalition is not doing that in Canberra. So it is up to the crossbench, and we're up for it. But what we will need, as we've had for the last 3.5 years, is the support of our communities, the support of experts like Tristan. I've been amazed by just the fact that people, when I reach out for help, people give it to me. And one of my steepest part of my learning curve in the first 6 months after I became a political candidate was knowing who to call. And Joy will laugh because I always said I didn't know, the difference between the Climate Council and the ACF and WWF and Greenpeace and the EDO and the AMCS and Renew Energy, all these different groups that, but I've got to the point now where I know that if I need to, I can call Ken Henry or Ross Garno or Graham Samuel or all of the various people in the space, and they will take my call because they know that I'm doing my very best to do something in an evidence-based fashion, and I want all the information that I can get to help me make the best decision that I can and to try to push things forward in an effective and rational way. And it's remarkable how generous people are. But I do rely on the expertise and the support of the community very much. Many people in our community have been really helpful, and Lighter Footprints, Beyond Gas Network and the ACF have been amazing. We meet every month and they tell me what they know and what they're hearing and what they think I need to know and what they know is coming soon, and how we talk about how to address it. It's incredibly helpful, and I'm very, very grateful for that support. And I would basically say to anyone in the audience, I know one of the things we'll probably talk about tonight is, well, how do we make a difference, when we've got this somewhat arrogant government that's not listening and not doing the right thing for the country in a number of different ways. We can do that, but we have to do it together. We've demonstrated already that we can do that, and it's going to be a lot of fun continuing to do it for the rest of this term of Parliament and hopefully beyond with your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monique. You can see she's a very hard worker. Now I'd like you to welcome to the stage Tristan Edis, who I mentioned before. Over to you, Tristan.
Thank you. How you going, Monique?
Yeah, good, Tristan.
Very good.
Yeah, good.
I'm a little bit nervous.
They're actually pretty nice.
Yeah, hopefully.
Most of them.
Yeah, be gentle on me. No, I'm supposed to be gentle on... Well, I'm not meant to be gentle on Monique, actually. Meant to put her under the hard lens. Look, we've sort of spoken about Labor, but a lot of the press attention right now is on the coalition and what they do about net zero as a commitment to net zero. I don't know what that means when you don't want to do anything. But the critical thing was you only won your seat very narrowly at the last election. And I'll just read out some things that have been quoted in the press to everyone, and I think this kind of... you mentioned that the Labor government, it's the majority that's a mile wide but wafer thin. So, you know, really what happens in your seat could be very important. And this is what was reported in The Australian, I don't think it was yesterday. This push, being resisted by top Conservatives, would see the coalition go to the next election vowing to maintain an aspiration under Paris to hit net zero, while refusing to tie it to any date and having no domestic policies to hit the goal. So this is apparently what the I suppose the people that are very concerned about climate change in the coalition are struggling to get everyone to agree to, is net zero with no date and no policies. And Andrew Bragg told the Australian Financial Review, in terms of his concerns, was, that's my red line, which means we have to have net zero this century. So that's what you're facing as you go into the next election. How the hell do you make sure that you win the next election when you're facing...
personally?
Yes, and that's who you're up against.
Well, it won't be Andrew Bragg. According to Channel 9 this morning, it will be Josh Frydenberg. We have a situation with... So the Nats have gone to net... They've done net zero. And the coalition, the Liberals have to decide whether or not they want to stay with the Nats, in which case they have to dump net zero and keep the coalition intact. If they do that, they will lose some moderates who will go and sit on the crossbench in the Senate, people like Andrew Bragg and Dave Sharma and Maria Kovacic. I'm not sure if anyone from the House would come and sit on the crossbench. It's getting quite crowded. But they'd probably lose some moderates in the Senate. Or the Liberals can say, right, we are actually committed to some form of net zero, you know, by at some point, hopefully this century, and, you know, that's this sort of aspirational thing. But as you say, they have no policies as to how they would achieve that. And it would not... I don't think any of us would feel that it was a full-throated, you know, commitment to that. I just don't see how it works. Actually, I just don't see that it works, because Australians are actually smart people, and at the last two elections, they have twice voted for action on climate change. They do believe in it, and they do want action on it. They're a bit concerned about the cost. They're certainly concerned about the time and how long it's taken. But I think it was Mel Clark on the ABC yesterday or today, it was saying, oh, it's like you decide to build a bridge and you plan how you're going to build the bridge, and you start to build the bridge, and then you say, oh, actually, maybe we'll build a tunnel. And you start the tunnel, but then you start complaining about how long it's all taking and how much it's costing, and then you go back to the bridge.
I think she said maybe we'll go round the hill rather than go over it. It was something that she said.
I think your average Australian's just saying, oh, come on, just do it. Because most people, even if they don't understand, you know, why electricity is expensive as it is, they can see that one side is committed to it and is trying to make a difference, imperfectly, but making progress, and the other side doesn't know what it believes. And I have to be honest, you know, one of the things for me that was most frustrating about the recent election was the fact that it was so very, very close in Coorong. It was really, really close. And I couldn't work out why that was, because I was up against someone who didn't have a policy on these things, who wouldn't talk about them. And I knew that it's the most important thing for many, many people, you know, in 2022, and I think in 25, for many, many people, it's the number one issue. and then it was still so close. But I think for me, for as long as I'm in Parliament, I'll try and take effective action on the things that I care about, and I'll try to take effective action on the things that people who come to talk to me about, that they worry about and they care about. And for me, that's going to be climate and environment. It is still the, and nothing that I've learned in the last 3.5 years has affected my belief that it is the most existential issue that we face.
I suppose do you see Zoe Daniel, who is sort of also part of the community independent movement, lost her seat to Tim Wilson? Do you see any lessons in that loss that you can make sure that you would do your campaign differently if they put up another person that does something like... I mean, I didn't follow the campaign closely, so I don't know what Tim Wilson did in that electorate that helped him win it back. But yeah, are you sitting there thinking, right, okay, how am I going to make sure I don't... what was a narrow win is not as narrow next time?
Sure. I mean, yeah, of course, you do think about those things. I did not run a perfect campaign in 2025. There's just no doubt about it. And I did a very significant review after the election campaign and talked to everyone from my team, talked to volunteers, talked to a whole range of people, experts, about what we could have done better. And there's no doubt that my team and I could have done some things better. And we will address those things next time. I'm sure Zoe's done the same. But there are other things there are the things, the known knowns, and there's the unknown unknowns, and there's the things you can't control, and then there's war in the Middle East, and then there's a redistribution that might make your life much, much more difficult 6 months out from an election. There are other things that I think if the election had been held a month later, the result in Goldstein might well have been quite different. I can't speak for Zoe. I know she's done a review on what happened in Goldstein, but and there are certain things I wouldn't tell you because I wouldn't want someone to little ears who might be sitting at home watching this right now be going, oh, maybe I should do this. But it's a tough game, but it's also, Nicolette Buller she did really well in Bradford in 2022, and then she basically put herself in place and worked incredibly hard for 3 years and then won by, I think, 22 votes. But she won. And she's there. I'm not sure that Giselle Captain right now is thinking, oh, bugger, because she'd be looking at what's going on in Canberra thinking, oh. But, you either you win or you lose, and it doesn't in the end matter if you win by 50 votes or 5.
I'll just sort of move on then to, do you think the fact that the coalition at the prior election could at least say, well, we do care about climate, we're going to do nuclear and that's zero emissions. It looks like they're not going to say that this time around. Do you think that did help persuade some people that perhaps were concerned about climate change to say, well, look, maybe they're a little bit suspect, but hey, they've put their body on the line here, gone for a pretty big and bold policy here. I'm going to take them on their word that they are serious about climate change and vote for them. That's potentially going to be thrown away. I mean, do you think that influenced anyone that cared about climate in Kooyong went, yep, they're going to do nuclear, therefore I think they are serious about
There were
climate?
some people who really like the idea of nuclear. Lots of people really like it. And they think it's clean. It's sustainable over a very long period, obviously. They look at markets elsewhere that have had nuclear for a long time, and it's very attractive as an energy source to some people. And that's actually why I went on the nuclear committee, the Parliamentary Nuclear Committee last year when there was an inquiry into it, because I had looked at all the information and the evidence, and I didn't think it was the right answer for us. I thought it was something that maybe we could have done 20 or 30 years ago, but we'd missed the boat. It was going to take too long and cost too much now. But I thought I owe it to all those many people who come up to me and say, it's actually a really good solution and we should be going there. So I went through that committee and I sat there and I, went to various places and heard from the experts. And at the end, my opinion hadn't changed. But, and I wrote a supplementary opinion to the committee's report that basically said, we've had 22 reports into this in Australia, inquiries into this at a state or federal level. This should be the last.
Sure.
But there are still nuclear zealots in the coalition, and if Ted O'Brien becomes opposition leader, he will... And Dan Tehan has just been on a tour, let's not forget. He's driving their energy policy and he has just been on a tour of the states and the nuclear facilities in the states, funded by someone who owns a uranium mine in Australia. So I'd be surprised if we've heard the last of nuclear.
Okay. Labor's 2035 target falls short of the science around trying to achieve or contain global warming to 1.5 degrees, or at least substantially below 2, and a number of people concerned about climate change, they're disappointed about that. But at the same time, I think Labor has a number of serious concerns, fears, from both a practical perspective but also obviously a political one. How do you yourself personally feel you can influence them to address those fears and concerns? Because it's not like they've just, we just like fossil fuels, so therefore we're not going to go for an ambitious target. There's something sitting behind there. How do you... Let's imagine you're in the balance of power and they're sitting there going, Monique, I'd love to do something harder, but I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. What do you think are the key things that they're worried about, and how would you persuade them to be less worried about them and perhaps get them over those concerns?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so there's a few things that they're worried about. One is social licence of the renewables transition and the resistance that they've experienced in rural and regional settings related to that. Another is that they are concerned about firming of our electricity supply and having adequate supply for manufacturing and the like. They are concerned that we're going to need gas for perhaps longer than some of us would like to provide that certainty for manufacturing and other sectors that are very reliant on it. And they're also affected, unfortunately, they are influenced by the lobbying groups, the fossil fuel lobbying groups. There's no two ways around it for mine. When they put out the Future Made in Australia plan and the gas strategy that has us using gas through to 2080, that's not based on evidence, but I think that's based on the lobbying industry and the lobbyists and the fossil fuel industries affecting their decision making and their strategy. And that's disappointing. But at the same time, and I was disappointed with the 62 to 70% target, everyone on the crossbench was. But it could have been worse, and it is a start, and it's not a cap, and we can improve on that. And so I think what we have to do is look at the details and look at the sectors and do the breakdowns and look at those areas where we can make a change and we can exceed expectations as we have with things like adoption of household solar and storage with home batteries, and we do need to continue to commit to things like decarbonising transport as best we can and try. A lot of those low-hanging fruit have already been, addressed and maybe sort of maximised, exhausted, but there's still some that we can address, and we can still do that, and we can push on with the other things. And I think we can probably move more quickly than the government perhaps is somewhat conservatively anticipating, and no one's going to be disappointed with that.
Sure. I'm going to channel Barnaby Joyce now. I'm not very good at his voice, and
I hope you're not going to swear a lot, because he swears a lot.
And I can't go as red in the face as he can. But he would look at us and say, oh, this is Kooyong. It's one of the wealthiest electorates in the country. my party represents some of the poorest electorates in the country. It's all fine to talk about net zero when you can afford an electric vehicle, you can afford solar and batteries, and then you don't have to worry about your power bill, and you don't have to worry about what might happen to, you know, putting a price on carbon or closing coal, because you're immune to it. There are some genuine people. There's a genuine issue there. There's people struggling to pay their next electricity bill. They're worried about filling up their car, and some of them would be very deeply worried. What are these crazy people in Kooyong got in mind for me that are going to really make me struggle? And so I suppose, yeah, sure, we can. But Barnaby Joyce is a bit of a fool in many respects, but underneath it all, there's something genuine and legitimate. How do we make sure those people are along for the journey and we can reassure them?
So the first thing I'd say is Barnaby Joyce is not a fool. He's much smarter than most people give him credit for, and as is Matt Canavan. And you underestimate them at your own peril. They're very, very clever politicians in many ways, very clever retail politicians. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's a misconception to say that everyone in Kooyong is wealthy and everyone's doing it just fine, because it's just not true. There's really good data to say that lots of people are struggling with mortgage anxiety or rent anxiety, that people are struggling to pay for electricity, and they are struggling. Gosh, if I had $1 for every conversation I had during the election campaign about the cost of specialist fees and dentistry and all of those sorts of things in a wealthy country where the figures, again, are pretty stark about the number of people who put off filling scripts or seeing a specialist or going to the dentist because they're just too scared of how much it's going to cost them. Those figures are not that much different for Kooyong. There are people doing it tough in Kooyong.
So what do we do about it?
So what I say to people is, I say, no, and they go, it's, you know, you don't understand, you know, yes, climate change, but I'm dealing with cost of living pressures. And I say to them, great. Not great, but, you know, okay. What are the things that are your biggest concerns? Let me guess. Energy prices and how much it costs for electricity and heating. Yes? How are we going to make that cheaper? Get gas out of the mix, because that's the most, you know, important input into electricity pricing is the gas. So if we can get gas out and transition to renewables, the price of electricity will fall. We also need to look at the electricity market itself, actually, and how electricity is priced, which is an interesting and separate piece, because we take it into we accept the way it's priced. And someone came and talked to me the other day and made a fairly eloquent case that we shouldn't, actually, that we should look at how the electricity market is set up and perhaps look at that question. But that's a separate question. So we need to help people get access to cheaper renewable energy. And if you're a renter, we need to help you do that, even though you might not be able to put solar on your own roof. But there are ways that we can do that with distributed energy networks and the like. We can bring the price of electricity down. What else do you care about? Your insurance? Your insurance premium's gone up hugely. Why is that? It's not because of floods and fires in Kooyong, but it's because of floods and fires in the rest of the country and the impact that they've had on insurance costs. And that's one of the biggest imposts for families. And the number of households that are not insuring in this country now is terrifying. So again, you know, if you want to deal with insurance costs for homes, large swathes of Australia are going to become uninsurable in the next 5 to 10 years.
I suppose the counter to that is this is a global problem. Those climate disasters are fuelled by a global environmental problem. I'm struggling to pay my power bill. How can we? It's fine. They can afford an EV. They can afford solar. And what are you going to do?
I'm going to help you afford a cheaper EV. Maybe it might be second hand, but I'm going to help you afford a cheaper EV. And there's ways that we can do that. I'm going to stop subsidising fossil fuels, whether it's $10 billion for the fuel tax credit.
Won't that drive my power bill up? Because if it's subsidised, then I'm getting a lower power bill.
Not with the fuel tax credit to large mining industries. I mean, last year, BHP got $600 million in the fuel tax credit. Rio Tinto got $400 million. You know, I'm going to stop subsidising
How's that
mining
help?
industries.
How's that help me that you?
I'm going to save $1 billion there just with those two companies and get them to use any fuel tax credits that they get for decarbonisation of that industry. But I'm going to limit the credits that they get. I'm going to take that money and I'm going to put it into helping households get access to storage and to solar and to renewable energy. But also to home modifications. You know, we still leave out the basic things like making sure that every house has got reasonable insulation and, you know, they're well designed and they're built in a way where we minimise their energy requirements. You know, all those sorts of things. So many different points in the spectrum where we can improve people's lot with relatively minor tweaks to the settings around regulations and things like that. But you have to be committed to doing it in the first place. And then people have to see that there's a benefit for them. And it's not going to be, you know, any airy-fairy, I'm doing this for the world, you know, I want to save the world and stop carbon emissions, because that's not real to people who are struggling to put food on the table. But if your groceries are more expensive because of a flood in Queensland or New South Wales, you can see the immediate impact of climate change. And people are going to start seeing those discrete and obvious things more and more often if we don't take action.
Sure. I'm going to try and lighten it up a little bit. You took part in the inquiry into nuclear power. You would have spent quite a lot of time with a number of MPs from other sides of the aisle and from Labor and Liberals and National Party. What are some positives about your colleagues that you learned out of that inquiry? Some things that you took away and went, oh, I think more nicely about that person as a result. I'm hoping
it's actually really interesting
nice.
on these committees. On the whole, on these committees, people get along pretty well. I'm on the health committee. We're doing an inquiry at the moment. It's health, disability and ageing. We're doing an inquiry into NDIS and it's going incredibly well and everyone's working respectfully and constructively together. The nuclear committee was different. It was very politicised and the coalition and Labor people often, you know, there'd be raised voices and people shouting over each other in front of witnesses, and it was a difficult one actually. I didn't enjoy it for that reason, and there were a number of occasions where I had to say to people, I'm going to remove myself from the room if you don't stop shouting at each other and behaving in this fashion. There was one occasion we were doing a really early morning meeting, it was like 6 because we were talking to people in the States, I think, and I just said, you are embarrassing me. You know, I'm embarrassed to be a part of this group that's behaving in this fashion.
I'm not hearing any positives.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think of one. I saw interesting bits of Queensland. It wasn't a particularly constructive one, and I guess that's what that committee was, a difficult one, because I think people came to it with preformed views and were just interested in trying to make that case all the time. I don't think that they were listening. I mean, you came, Tristan, and testified to that committee. Did you feel that people were listening with, you know, open ears and wanting to?
I suppose I came with the same agenda, and I quite enjoyed it because they didn't like it questioning me.
It was
and
quite
so
combative.
It was quite enjoyable, actually. Watching them be fearful of asking me questions and saying I wasn't allowed to answer their questions. That was interesting.
He was quite combative.
But anyway, all right, let's move on then. That was there were no positives. So
we were seeking for truth, and I think we found. I would hope that people who came to us, the bulk of people who came to us, felt that they were listened to and they had an opportunity to express their views. And one of the ones that I thought was particularly important was when many of the traditional owners, you know, they needed to have an opportunity to speak to parliamentarians about how they felt about this, and that was positive. I'd say that was a positive, and I really enjoyed that and felt it was a privilege to hear their experiences and their viewpoints. But I'm not sure that everyone in the committee was listening with as open a mind as I perhaps had at that point in time.
Okay. This is going to be the last question, and then we'll open up to audience questions. Let's move forward. You've won your seat comfortably at the next election. You hold the balance of power. But Ted O'Brien is now the leader of the Liberal National Coalition.
Yeah.
He's desperate for you to give an indicator that he can go to the Governor-General and say, I have the confidence of the Parliament. He's absolutely desperate. He's come to you and he said, you can have one thing on climate policy. One thing and one thing only. What is it? And I need a really convincing argument to tell my colleagues why they should accept it. What would it be, and what would be the argument you give Ted so that he could win over his colleagues?
Oh, gee.
Because he'll need
Questions
help.
from the audience. Look, I don't know. I mean, if people say to me, what is the one thing you would say that we need to do about climate and environment right now, I would say no new coal and gas developments.
Okay, what's the argument so he can persuade his colleagues?
No, but at the same time, I would also be saying no to nuclear because I don't think it's the answer either. So there has to be some sort of middle path there. So it wouldn't necessarily be new gas developments, but certainly a change to the way that we export fossil fuels and the agreements and circumstances around that. So I don't think I have a single thing. I think I would have I think I would need to sit down and have a conversation about these sorts of things. Ted O'Brien, again, is not a stupid person. He's actually a really bright man. He has his beliefs that I don't agree with, but I respect him as someone who does care deeply about this and is better informed than most would say. I think he's got a blind spot on nuclear, but in other respects, you know, he is someone that you could work with potentially.
Do you think it's possible to give him an argument that he could persuade his colleagues?
It's not up to me to give him something that he can persuade his colleagues with. If we were in a situation where the crossbench had the balance of power after the next election, it might be a majority of one, but it wouldn't be one person. Do you know what I mean? So there would be a number of people on that crossbench, and there would be negotiations by a number of individuals around the things that they care very deeply.
I'm giving you a hypothetical here.
Yeah.
That you can play with.
I don't think that it'd be anyone.
Let's imagine
Ted
said, I want you to come with me to the party room. I want you to make the pitch to my party room. What would you, I know you've only got 2 minutes to make that pitch to the coalition party room for why they should.
I would do it on the economics. I'd do it on the economic argument of the need to transition to a decarbonised economy and the benefits of that for our economy overall.
Okay, let's move to the audience questions.
Oh, have you got? Did you want?
We'll have to your microphone.
Have you
Tristan? Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to do the first one? Okay. I'll start with the question that's been voted up the most. Monique, how should leaders in all levels of government respond to the gravity of the National Climate Risk Assessment?
Well, I think the first thing is that they should read it, and they should read all the detail that's in the National Climate Risk Assessment. And those people who have access to it should read all the detail of the Office of National Intelligence reports into the impacts of climate change. And they should consider it in detail, and they should look at the science. And if they are a leader of substance, I think that they'll take those things on board. They won't question the science that underpins them. They'll respect the work and the expertise of the scientists and economists who've come up with these pieces, and they'll resolve to take action on them and commit to doing that publicly, and commit to giving the people that they represent a pathway to doing that. The easiest thing in the world, and as a doctor I saw this many times, and it's an extraordinary thing when you see it, denial is one of the strongest human impulses. And you know, you see people who deny, they know that they've got cancer, or they know that they've got this or that, but they cannot admit it to themselves. And that people do that with climate change. And the reality is, if you sat there and thought about all the implications of all of this every day, none of us would get out of bed. You know, you couldn't. So you do have to get up and keep going and live your life as best you can and make the best decisions that you can in your own sphere of influence. But it is contingent on leaders to do this and to do it responsibly. And part of that has to be giving people an understanding of what we can achieve. And that, you know, we can move forward. We might not have the answers right now, and the targets that we have might not be strong enough. And perhaps not all the technology is in place right now, but we have exceeded expectations in many times, on many occasions in the past. We can do it again. I believe that we will do it again, but we have to get going on that process, and we have to be open and committed to that.
Okay, the next one is, do you have concerns about the government's gas futures strategy, apart from the ones you've already expressed?
Yeah, so the government's future gas strategy, which has us committed to gas, you know, into the second half of this century, I think it's deeply problematic. And I would hope that we can render it obsolete in the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to need some gas for a period of time, but we're not going to need it to, I would hope, not, you know, beyond, certainly not into the second half of this century, and I would hope that we could get off it more quickly than that.
Why is the cost of climate inaction not highlighted more to counter claims that the cost of climate action is too expensive, too costly and inappropriate? Why do you think that doesn't get more? It's a
really interesting thing. It's always harder to prove as sort of a negative, and that's one of the things that with the preventative health that I've been talking about quite a bit. So chronic diseases are responsible for 9 out of 10 deaths in Australia, and there's lots of evidence to demonstrate that if you spend money on prevention of chronic diseases, you know, dealing with the remediable risk factors like obesity or high cholesterol, you know, other risk factors for cardiac disease, respiratory disease, other conditions, that, you know, preventative health is, you know, it's really cost effective, and the multipliers are the return on investment is somewhere between $2.50 and $9. Depending on what area you're looking at. So it's really cost effective. It makes sense to spend money on preventive health. No government will do it. Because it's not obvious. You don't see the win. You don't see the effect that you're having. And I think to some extent perhaps the cost of climate inaction is a bit like that. People don't see it. They can't appreciate it.
Even with all the, you know, extreme weather events and costs of bushfires and floods and...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not arguing that it should be a part of the parcel, and that, you know, when you take that into account, you know, it overwhelms the cost of action. But as Tristan said, you know, people say, yeah, but I can't pay my rent this week. And I can't afford food for my kids. You know, that's what they're seeing and that's what they're dealing with, and that is front of mind for them.
Okay. Do you support Australia hosting the next COP event?
Do I support, yes, Australia hosting COP? Well, I don't think we're going to get it. I do. I think that it would have been a great thing for us to hold it, and for a number of reasons. I think the economic benefit would have been huge for us holding it. It would have, you know, cost a bit, but the benefit overall would have far outweighed the cost of holding it. But I think also it would have involved us committing to regional activities and to potentially better, you know, more effective and more restrictive targets. And, you know, and particularly I think it would have been a demonstration of a show of faith and something that we would have done with our Pacific neighbours, and that opportunity will be lost. I think it's really disappointing that we don't have, that we won't be, I don't think we'll be hosting the next COP.
And kind of related theme. What can we do to stop native forest logging nationally?
So native forest logging is one of those ones that's just incredibly frustrating. So last week, one of the 80 amendments that we had last Thursday was to abolish the regional forest agreements and have native forests come back under the EPPC Act at a federal level, and to have national regulation of forestry and native forests. Another part of that was trying to minimise the deforestation that we know has been such an issue for the country for many years. It's again incredibly frustrating that the government hasn't committed to that. Now, Murray Watt has said that it will be in the delegated legislation, that there will be an equivalent to abolition of the RFAs under the EPPC Act, and that there is a stipulation to that in the second reading speech that he gave, which is better than nothing, the second reading speech about the EPPC Act. But again, it was like, well, Graham Samuel said you should do it, and you say that you're adopting Graham Samuel's report effectively with most of these changes. And Susan Lee had also said that she was supportive of the vast majority, if not all, of the recommendations in Graham Samuel's review. We couldn't work out why he wouldn't put that through in the House, if only as a sort of a demonstration of good faith. There will be amendments in the Senate if the government is dependent on the Greens to pass the legislation. That native forest obviously is one of the things that they're sticking to. But I suspect the Liberals are going to support it, and it will go through with coalition backing, and they won't need the Greens, which would be a very bad outcome for us.
Can you explain why we charge little or nothing when we allow fossil fuel companies to extract and sell our gas? This might solve the economic problems of a large percentage of the population.
Yeah, so that just speaks to policy failure over decades. It's that simple. And we could change it now. I mean, even right now we could change regulation around uncontracted gas, but the government's still reluctant to do that. And unfortunately, I think that reflects the influence on the government of the multinational gas companies, which is a really tough thing to have to say. It's incredibly disappointing that is the case.
And I'll read out the next question. I feel I could verbal them a little bit, but have the Greens and the crossbench not learnt the lessons of pragmatism? Why are they still opposing progressive legislation instead of taking small wins? So the Greens and crossbench has progressive legislation been rejected?
Yeah, no one's forgotten CPRS. I think the Greens are reminded of it every day before they go to bed. They think, don't forget the CPRS. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And that's true. And I think that one of the reasons why the Greens did poorly in this recent federal election is they were seen as blockers and as being incessantly and relentlessly negative. And I, to some extent, agree with that characterisation in some ways. It's probably not entirely fair, but there's some truth to it. With this legislation this week, the EPPC legislation, I had to decide whether or not to vote for it or not. And I knew that if I didn't vote for it, the Liberals will be saying in 2028 she voted against nature and environmental legislation. But I couldn't vote for it because it was a dog. I just couldn't. And at first I was really torn, but the more I looked at it, the more deficiencies I found in it. And that was it, in a week. There's going to stuff that's going to come to light, and we're going to see how rubbish that legislation is, and I'll feel better. I think I'll feel better that I didn't vote for it. Some of the crossbench did. I couldn't find it in myself to support it because I think it's really poor legislation, and it's in some ways going to make things worse rather than better. But I don't think that, I guess every piece of legislation that we have, you know, I take it on its merits and I try to make a decision based on the evidence as best I can understand it. It is sometimes hard, and there have been times I've voted for things like the safeguard mechanism that I thought were really flawed in some ways, but in the end it was better than not having something, and it was imperfect, but it was, you know, I didn't want to let perfect be the enemy of good, but I think we are all conscious of opportunities lost in the past from that process.
What can the crossbench do to ensure there is transparency and freedom of information and that it's effective and accessible for the community?
Well, the Freedom of Information Bill, I mean, one good news piece about that is it got rammed through the House last week. I do not think it's going to get through the Senate. So that's good because it's opposed by every single person other than the government in the Senate, and I don't think that the Liberals will cave on that. It was an appallingly bad piece of legislation, so I think it's doomed. So fortunately, I don't think that those changes will go through. But freedom of information it's so important. There's so much to talk about there, and that's one of the things that the crossbench feels really deeply about, and we will continue to try and push the government on that as best we can. I mean, this morning I was at a press conference talking about the fact that we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to keep 100 people on Nauru, and that a lot of that money is being funneled from the Nauruan government to bikie gangs. And that's information that's come out through whistleblowers, and we haven't improved whistleblower protections in recent years. That's something the crossbench cares about a lot. It's also been, people have gone looking for that information around that in Senate estimates, and we're still trying to get more information around it through things like FOIs. So we use every tool that we can that is at our disposal. It takes a bit of work, but that sort of digging is really, really important, and things do come to light from those processes that we wouldn't know otherwise.
And the next question might be something you'd like to weigh in on too, Tristan, or you can both. How can the Parliament heed Saul Griffith's warning about tech bros potentially price gouging, so as our grid becomes more sophisticated and complex and we have distributed storage, and it will need quite complex software to manage all that efficiently. What control does the Parliament have to make sure that we design a system? As you said, Monique, we need to look at how we are charging for electricity. So what can the Parliament do to safeguard the interests of consumers?
Sorry, Monique, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to explain how tech bros can...
Well, you can start with that, Tristan, but one thing I would say is we can make the tech bros and their platforms pay tax in this country, which we don't do now.
I think what Saul was talking about, actually he's taller than I thought he was. I met him the other day and I was like, I had this idea because he had curly hair. I think he was shorter than me, but he's taller than me, which I was very disappointed about. I'm not that tall, I suppose. Anyway, I have to give up my basketball career. So at the moment, even very large electricity companies have delegated the control of their batteries to what they call algorithmic bidding businesses. So what they are is essentially companies that have got very clever software that analyses what's going on in the electricity market and has incredible computational power and works out, oh, well, if you did this with the battery and you withhold a little bit of capacity, then you'll jack the price up and then you'll make a lot more money from the remaining amount of capacity. Now, the problem, part of the issue is lots of people have delegated their batteries to these algorithmic bidding companies. And now there's an issue, wait a second, you guys are meant to be in competition with each other, but you've all delegated your batteries to this one company that controls them all and then probably can coordinate the bidding between them all to withhold capacity to essentially jack the price up and then make lots of money. So this is something that regulators are now aware of. And so it is a bit problematic that can happen. Now, if you own a battery, you could always delegate your battery to these algorithmic software companies to make lots of money for you as well. But it does kind of undermine competition. So that's one element of the tech bro movement. The other element of the tech bro movement, I think, is actually incredibly ridiculous hype about nuclear becoming suddenly cheap. At the moment in the US, this is a very investor-hot area, is artificial intelligence and nuclear. This idea that nuclear will rise and become a very successful technology off the back of supporting or feeding power into AI is happening, but it's really feeding off essentially a speculative bubble on the stock exchange in the US. And unfortunately, when you have a speculative bubble going on, you just have to have tenuous links to whatever is the hot topic, and stupid people will throw lots of money at it, and then those tech bros walk away before the bubble bursts and don't ever have to deliver on something, but then can undermine belief in things. And we saw this in the inquiry. The first question that was put to me was by one of the coalition party room was, hey, aren't they building all these nuclear reactors to power their artificial intelligence? What would you know? Microsoft, Google, all these guys are doing all these deals with nuclear companies. And I said, has anyone spent any money on these nuclear power plants? And the answer is no. They were all memorandums of understanding that meant nothing. So that's kind of part of the problem. But these tech bro guys have worked out, hey, this is another way I can make money. I'll put up a listed company, I'll float it on the stock exchange, people will throw lots of money, and by the time I actually have to deliver anything and people start going, where's the revenue? I've walked away with after cashing in my shares. So that's something I think we need to keep a close eye on.
I think this probably goes to more councils. But how can local councils be encouraged to own their own green generation storage instead of just purchasing carbon credits to meet zero emissions? It applies to state governments as well, but I think they're normally the funders rather than receiving it. But hopefully they would also look at self-generation.
Do you want to take that one?
There has been an issue where a number of councils have ambitious targets for emission reductions, but they don't have a lot of legislative power to achieve those targets. So they then can kind of often go, oh, how can we make it look like we're doing something meaningful? Okay, let's go buy some international credits overseas that cost very, very little. And hey, voila, we're carbon neutral, we've achieved our targets. And I feel I've actually got a lot of sympathy for councils, because they're trying to respond to their electorates by doing something useful and trying to make an impact on the environment, but they don't have a lot of money and they don't have a lot of legislative power. But at the same time, they've got to balance, well, do I actually just own up to everyone and say, hey, you know, that's really popular, it's what you want to do, I want to do too. I want the whole electorate to go 100% renewables, but I don't have the means to do it, and I'm not going to fool you that I can do it. And so what you need to do is go lobby your state minister or state ministers or MPs, and federal ministers. Don't lobby me, and I'm not going to give you some kind of false hope. Is probably one of the things that I think councils perhaps could do a better job of, but it's hard to say I'm not going to do anything because I can't genuinely make the kind of level of difference. But I'll give you a really good, sorry, I'm going to crap on a bit here. Several years ago, I spoke to a Melbourne City councillor whose name I'll leave nameless, who got up at a conference and said, yes, we have a commitment to the City of Melbourne to be 100% renewables, and we've got this plan to do it. And he got down, I said, are you serious? You're going to make the whole of Melbourne 100% renewables, or even the city of Melbourne? That's pretty impressive. He goes, yeah, we've got it all sorted. So I wrote that up and said, Melbourne City Council is going to drive the whole of Melbourne to, as in their area, to 100% renewables. This is bloody amazing. They're going to do this procurement thing. It's incredible. And I got this very angry call from the media manager saying, why did you write that? That's just ridiculous. We're not going to do that. And I said, but that's your policy commitment. Oh, but it's ridiculous. We'll never be able to achieve it. At which point I said, oh, that's interesting. So that my next article followed up the very next day was, my mistake, council announced ambitious renewable energy target and I believed it.
Monique, I don't know how much you can answer this because it's about other parties, but can you explain why you think the major parties did not support the duty of care motion or bill?
No. No, I mean, I think one of the concerns is the duty of care. There's some concerns about the legality of it, and I'm probably not the right person to speak to, but I think some people do have some concerns about whether you can actually legislate that effectively in the way that it's been put in front of the government or proposed. But I think it's a good thing that it has been proposed either way, and I think it should continue to be proposed, and we should continue to have this discussion. The recent International Court of Justice finding and other findings internationally are bringing more and more to the fore the concept of a duty of care to subsequent generations, and I personally think that we have one morally, even if we don't have one legally. And every time we talk about that, and we kind of name and shame people who won't commit to it. But I don't think we've been given a decent reason from the major parties as to why they won't get behind it. And try to, if not legislate that particular bill, legislate something that puts in place a commitment, an acknowledgement of the significance and import of things like climate change and our responsibilities around that to the next generation.
One more. Cost of renewables is likely to be the opposition's 3-word slogan for the next 2.5 years or 2+ years. What do you think is the single most effective argument against this?
Well, there are economic arguments, but they're difficult to prosecute because people tend to sort of phase out after 10 or 15 seconds. One of them is just pointing to discrete and obvious things. So Griffiths is doing the decarbonisation and electrification of Wollongong, and that's going to be a really interesting project when we see how much it decreases the cost of energy and the like for the homes in that area. We've talked about whether or not it would be possible to do that here. It would be an amazing thing to be able to do. You really would have to throw a lot of time and effort and money at it, but it would be an amazing thing to undertake. But every person who speaks to their neighbour who says, gee, it's great, I have an electricity bill of $1 a quarter, or gee, it's great not having to fill up your car with petrol, which is really expensive. And people see those discrete and real benefits over time. That's probably the most convincing thing for me.
I think we might wrap it up there and put your hands together to thank Monique.
And a big thanks to David and Julia as well, very ably facilitated.